Okay, well, I'm going to talk to you about immigration this afternoon, but I'm going to locate it in talking about my own constituency of Barking and Dagenham. As hopefully most of you will know, is we had the challenge of taking on the British National Party in 2010, and I feel that my greatest political achievement in all my 40 years in public life has been smashing Nick Griffin when he got rid of me and setting him on the road to temporary, if not permanent, oblivion. But my experience in Barking, my experience still today in Barking and Dagenham, has really strongly influenced the views that I want to express around immigration today. When I first became the MP there in 1994, I'll never forget, so this is going to be a bit of a story to start with. I never forget walking out of the tube station in Barking. I'd been worked in community politics in Islington for 20 years, walking out of the tube station in Barking into a completely white area, which was very, very strange for the whole of Greater London. And the other thing that hit me in those early days of 1994 was that I'd never met so many great-grandmothers who lived within 10 minutes walking distance of their great-grandchildren. So it was a very closed, white, working-class community. Most people who worked in Ford's. Ford's at its height employed something like 36,000 people. And if you didn't work in Ford's, you worked in one of the ancillary companies associated with Ford's. And kids used to get recruited at the age of 14 in the schools into these permanent, well-paid, trade unionized jobs. And so didn't get many qualifications because they didn't need them for work. And the whole of the borough was basically owned by the public, either by the GLC, LCC, GLC, or indeed by the local authorities. So over 95% of the housing was publicly owned. So families were used to, they'd start married life in one of the high-rise blocks, and as they had their children, they moved down into the terraced houses. That was life sort of in the 70s, 80s. That's what they'd been used to for generations. And then things changed. The first thing to change was right to buy. And almost half of the housing in Barking and Dagenham was privatised. And as it got privatised, people bought it up. What then happened was some people sold on, and they sold to second, third generation migrants, immigrants who'd come in the 50s, from places like Lewisham, lots of African people who, because housing in Barking Dagenham is relatively cheap, it was their first step on the home ownership ladder. They bought that way. Or they bought under right to buy, moved out and let. And they tended to let to hard-pressed inner London councils who put their recently arrived asylum seekers in those days into the housing. So the first time I met it was when the Kosovans came over in the late 1990s during the Kosovan crisis. That changed. Ford's changed. Ford's now employs hardly anybody, about probably less than 100 people from Barking and Dagenham now work in Ford's, and the total workforce is diminishing. Every time I use a figure, it's gone down from what it was before. And therefore the jobs went as well. And therefore what happened was the whole of the borough, we underwent the most rapid transition of any place in the whole of the country. IPPR did a study of migration across the whole of the UK, and Barking and Dagenham came out as the one that changed more rapidly. And just to quote some stats, and these are stats that take you through to from the census of 2001 to 2011. The white population in 2001 was over 80%. By 2011, 10 years later, it was less than 50%. And I think if we took it today, you'd probably get it down to 40%. Black Africans tripled, more than tripled in that 10 years. Muslims went up almost 4 times. And privately renting went up 3 times in that year, from 5% to 15%. And at the same time as all that massive transition that happened, other things went wrong. Both the Labour government and the previous Conservative government failed to build any decent homes at prices people could afford. So as the housing got privatised, there wasn't an alternative for these families to go into. The Labour government under the Blair-Brown years, we really failed to invest in people's environment. So the housing was all, was poor. The environment was poor. In one of my worst estates, every time you went up on the lifts, there were condoms and drug and needles around in all the cavities, and terrible smells, urine smelling all the way through. We just didn't invest in working class areas and in the lives of working class families. And if all this is happening around you, so lack of investment, no quality housing, no jobs, and a changing environment, of course people respond. And if you suddenly find your neighbours have changed, and you suddenly find that the food in the shops is different, and you suddenly find that the faces in the schools are different, that creates fear. It does create, we all have a fear of change. And it's all too easy for the middle classes who don't undergo this sort of change in their environment to be critical of it. And I think very, very strongly, I think if I lived in Barking, I don't live in Barking Dagenham, I work in Barking Dagenham. If I'd lived there, I'd have felt that same fear of change. And it was in that environment of fear of change that people moved to the extreme right. And that gives me the final ingredient of what was wrong there. And then I'll talk a bit about the positive. What was wrong was the Labour Party in Barking Dagenham, and there's a lesson here for Labour, both in relation to the SNP and Labour in our heartlands elsewhere. The Labour Party in Barking Dagenham was a complete Tammany Hall party. It was small. It was inward looking. It was full of middle-aged men. It was full of really the old trade unionists who'd worked at Ford's. It didn't welcome the diversity that was becoming part of the borough. Women, I can't quite understand how they selected a woman, but they did select me. And they were all middle-aged. So in that environment, and they talked to each other. All they cared about was the politics of the inward-looking group. Nobody thought about talking outwards. So the Labour Party wasn't there to help people through all this period of change and transition in their community. And that's why people turned to the right. That's why the BNP was welcomed with open arms, and it led to the increase there. And I always remember, I sort of kicked myself for this, in 2001, so this is before 12 BNP councillors were elected in 2006. In 2001, I was really worried because I had a very low turnout. Just think about this general election results. And I decided to do, they didn't want me to do any work. They didn't want me to have an office there, they wanted me to go off and enjoy myself in Westminster and leave them to get on with their Tammany Hall politics in the borough. But in 2001, I was worried about this low turnout, so I did some qualitative work talking to some women on an estate, one of my really tough council estates. And what came out of that, and I should have listened in 2001, was that people weren't apathetic. That wasn't why I had the low turnout. They were angry. It was anger, not apathy. Angry that we weren't listening to them, we weren't responding to their needs, we didn't understand the impact a changing community would have on them, the lack of housing, the lack of jobs, the lousy environment. It was anger that impelled them in 2001 not to vote. By 2006, they had an alternative vote. They had to vote. They had the vote to vote BNP, and 12 BNP councillors were elected to the council. At that time, some of you may remember, I started talking about the BNP, and I got totally lambasted by too many colleagues on the Labour side who said I was providing the BNP with the oxygen publicity, and that was what was leading to their growth in the borough. Absolute nonsense. But if you didn't start talking about these issues and talking about immigration, nobody was talking about immigration in 2006. You couldn't even start to reconnect with the people who felt totally alienated from you and whom you wanted to bring back, feeling that Labour was the home and Labour was the party that could represent them. And the other thing to say to you, there were really scurrilous myths going around at that time. I remember this well. The local paper had a headline one week saying, Africans for Essex. Underneath that headline was a story that Hackney Council was giving all its tenants loads of money to come and buy properties in the newly privatised housing in Barking and Dagenham. When you dug underneath that, what Hackney Council was actually doing was trying to get families out of the larger homes by giving them a financial incentive, bit of money, which allowed them to buy a house, and they gave up their right to a council home for life. So it was a way of allowing those homes to be reused for other people in need. One family from Hackney bought a home in Barking and Dagenham. Yet from that headline, the myth grew, and there was enough change going around for people to feel that actually Hackney was bringing the Africans into Essex and destroying this very close-knit East End white community in Barking and Dagenham. In all this, how did I respond? I could have walked away, and I decided, because actually fighting racism was the heart of what brought me into politics, that I couldn't do that. And I did three things. I rebuilt the Labour Party. So one of the things I'm proudest of is if you come now to see Barking Labour Party, it is ethnically mixed. There are loads of women in there. And also there's a huge age diversity. And we're an outward-looking, campaigning party. And what was more with that, I completely changed the way I do my politics. So now everything I do has to pass this test. Does it help me reconnect with people? And if I can reconnect, can I rebuild trust? And I had to bring back and build trust with the white working class vote, not just politicize the ethnic minority vote, but actually bring back the white working class vote. So I don't cut ribbons, I don't go to town hall shindigs. Everything I do has to build trust. And it's in building that trust I want to bring us back to immigration. So how do I do it? One of the things I'll do, for example, and I'm going to tell you these stories because they tell you about immigration and how it and the impact it can have on communities. I will ask 1,000 people to come and have a cup of coffee with me. And that means I've written to 1,000 people, they've got a letter from me. Probably 70 turn up. And we put them on little tables with coffee and good chocolate biscuits. And then we go table to table. I go table to table. I have volunteers at all the tables. And I don't talk to them about what's happened in the Westminster bubble. I don't set the agenda from what I've been told to do on my mobile from authorities on high, campaign on this. I always delete all those texts I get from the Labour hierarchy. But I just say, what's bugging you? What's important to you? And what happens out of that is everybody's politics is local. It's a truism, but it's worth thinking and reflecting on. So what happens in their local community is what concerns them. And it might be the potholes, it might be something about the sighting of a bus stop, it might be a little bit of antisocial behaviour, or it'll be issues like immigration, which impact on them, on their local community. But I allow them to tell the story of their local concerns. And then I bring everybody together and we talk about the local concerns. So I will say, well, there's a rat run here. This seems to be the issue that matters. And then just to finish that quickly before coming back to immigration, I also talk about immigration. I then go off and sort the rat run out, or the little bit of antisocial behaviour, whatever it is. I write to them all again saying, thank you for coming and have a cup of tea with me. So they've heard from me twice. This is the issue that you've raised. I then do the sorting, write to them a third time and say, I've sorted the rat run. And then you begin to rebuild trust. And that's how you bring people back. But let me then talk about immigration, because immigration comes up most times. And what is so interesting about it, I'll tell you about sort of various stories. This is one that happened very recently in what was an area where the BNP was very strong, where UKIP is now extremely strong. And we got through I was actually talking about a rat run there. We got through and we were back together again. And this woman who was about 50 or 60 got up and she's shaking with fury. And she said to me, "You're just not getting it, Margaret. You don't understand. You've let this borough go down the pan. Look at all these illegal immigrants. They've all come in here. They've ruined it. Barking is rubbish today." So I took a deep breath and say what I'd always do. which is that why the borough has changed, how I can't turn the clock back, but how I want to make it work for all of them. And I could see, and then the other thing she went on, she said, they're all scroungers. They're all scroungers. They're all taking our benefits, she said. And then she said, and they're filling our hospitals. We can't get into the hospital because all these immigrants, these awful immigrants, are in there. And I felt after I responded to her, I just wasn't really connecting. And then I thought, Christ, this is going to be a heavy afternoon. Then somebody else got up, a guy who was about 50, 60, and he said, I've been on benefits for 25 years. I've got a mental health condition. I'd much rather be in work. I run out of money at the end of every month. I'm not a scrounger. And he sat down. And then a Jamaican, also about 60, got up and said, I've lived in this country for 40 years. I brought my 2 daughters up. They're both through university. I've paid my taxes. I'm British. And he sat down. And then a young Caribbean woman got up and said, I'm a nurse. What's wrong with the hospitals is not me being there, it's the bureaucracy. And she sat down. So it was a really powerful conversation going on. At the end of the afternoon, I thought, I'd better go and see this. We were breaking up. I thought, I'd better go and see this woman. She was really angry. I went up to talk to her to say, are you all right? And she said, do want to talk to you, Margaret, but I just want to go and say I'm sorry to the other 2 men. And she went off and apologised. That was a powerful exchange. Again, telling you how a little bit of actually old-fashioned community development can start building the bridges and getting communities working together in a way that all this talk at Westminster just won't get you anywhere. Let me just tell you some other things about the complex attitudes I came across as I did this reconnection. The Eastern Europeans are appalling about voting. The Poles will never vote. You can see why they're suspicious of it. If they do, they tend not to vote Labour anyway. But my most funny occasion was coming across a Lithuanian. I spent 10 minutes trying to persuade this Lithuanian. It was really important that they should come out and vote. Having had the 10 minutes at it, she said, all right, I will vote, Margaret, as long as you get rid of those Romanians. I had another case, and this happened quite often, of a woman who came to the door, a grandmother, and she had a mixed-race grandchild literally hanging onto her apron strings, and she said, I'm voting BNP, Margaret. You know, you've let too many of these immigrants in. And I said, but you know what would happen to your little grandchild? They'd send him and his father back. She said, I don't care. I'm still voting BNP. And then my final example, just to show you the complexity of attitudes that we get in this mix, was going to one of my local comprehensive schools, talking to year 10, so kids of 14, 15. And this little boy who'd grown up actually in a multiracial community, so he wasn't one of the old white working class East End, he'd been there when the community changed. He said, too many immigrants, Mrs. Hodge. And at this point I thought, oh, I can't bear this. And the deputy head turned around and said, tell Mrs. Hodge what your name is. And it was D'Souza. And where were you born? And of course he wasn't born in the UK. So he himself was an immigrant, but had adopted these attitudes from his parents. That demonstrates a little bit of the complexity you face in actually trying to build a strong community through a period of transition, which is what I'm experiencing, when the nature of the community changes as rapidly as it did in Barking Dagenham. But one important thing that we did as well was in 2010, when we really took them on, we didn't cave into racism once. Indeed, we put up Asian and African candidates with Asian and African names in all our most BNP wards. And every single one of them got in. So you can deal with these issues without in any way giving any ground to the racism. And I have to say, some of my colleagues, some of the constituencies that I went to this time round, didn't take that. In fact, one marginal constituency, which I won't name, when I arrived was 20 Barking and Dagenham members to help them in it. And it was a mixed group bunch of people I came with. The organiser said to me, we can't put black faces on to knock on the doors of white people. And I was so shocked, but and wouldn't take them away. So what does all this teach me about the wider issue of immigration, and this is where I want to take us. The first thing is that all of us, all mainstream politicians, have got to stop lying about our ability to control migration by numbers, which is why the title of this talk. Migration is a feature of globalization, and in the same way that capital is going across borders, so are people. And in today's world, we are an attractive destination. I learnt this morning here at the festival that 50% of black men here are marrying white women. It's still odd. I'm going to have to check this stat out if it's true. But it's such an interesting statistic if it is true. So we're much more tolerant. We're much more open. We're a successful economy. We're an attractive place for people to come. We cannot control the numbers. And every time a mainstream politician gets up and promises they'll cut to tens of thousands, yet again promised by the Conservatives this time round, they will fail to deliver. And every time you fail to deliver, you cut trust, you break trust. And if you break trust in mainstream politics, you get this development of fringe politics. And you can just see from the figures last week, 318,000 net migration. Why on earth does Cameron, why don't they learn, and why don't they just stop talking numbers? The only thing that might cut it would be getting out of Europe, but even there, if you look at where the net migration comes from, half of the increase has come from non-European countries, half has come from European countries. So it is a global feature. And if you think how awful the Tory-led government was over the last 5 years about immigration. Do you remember the bus going around encouraging people to go home? Actually, even with all that horrible atmosphere, voluntary repatriation was still at lower levels than it has been elsewhere. So the first thing is stop talking numbers. But do talk about, and this is what I learned from Barking, that people don't really care about the numbers. They do care about this concept of fairness. So that when you come into a country, you spend some time earning your spears just by contributing to the country before you then are entitled to receive out of it. Now, when I first said that in an article in The Observer in 2008, the world fell in on me. I had a horrible time where people said to me, this is fascism, this is the talk of the BNP. It isn't. It's a way of bursting that bubble of suspicion about the impact that migration can have on your life. And that issue of fairness resonates, whether it's around access to social housing, which you're always going to have to ration, or whether it's around access to benefits. But don't think it's the answer, because if you look just, for example, at the benefits, only 6% of EU migrants actually claim out-of-work benefits, and probably most of those who do that have been here for a long time, so are as British as I'm an immigrant myself, so that's why I sort of can talk about a lot of these issues. But, you know, I would count myself as British. I'd count myself as entitled to out-of-work benefits when the electorate decided to put me out of work. You know, it's a complete phoniness to think again that is going to assuage people. So my second thing is, do introduce issues around fair access. The third thing is, just show some control where you can, so strong borders where you have them. We are just completely, utterly, totally useless at doing the little things we can do. In my work in the Public Accounts Committee, we looked at foreign national offenders. If you come here actually looking for a job and you end up in jail, I think you lose the right to be here. Now, you can't believe this, but Charles Clarke lost his job over his failure to deport foreign national offenders after they'd completed their time here. The last government increased by tenfold the number of people working in this area and didn't increase by any number at all the number of foreign national offenders that they deported. There were over 10,000 of them, and 1 in 6 of foreign national offenders abscond when they've completed their sentence and disappear. We've lost 50,000 people whose application to stay in this country has been rejected because we don't look after them. We've got nearly 30,000 outstanding asylum applications which date back to at least 2007. So if we just controlled those things that we could control, if we were efficient there, I think you'd build, people don't worry so much about numbers, they worry that we've lost control. It's the issue of control that they feel strongly about, not numbers. And then very finally, because I'm nearly up in my half hour, I think we need a different leadership. We need to start, actually, we need a bold leadership from all the mainstream political parties around immigration. And we just haven't got it. People are petrified of it. Why can't we talk up the benefits of immigration? We never do that. The benefits to the economy, the benefits to the culture, the benefits to our public services. That strong leadership, I think, could change the whole centre of gravity of the debate around migration. I always look back at 97, when, if you remember, Mrs. Thatcher had said there's no such thing as society. I thought when Labour came in, we'd find it very difficult to reassert the importance of community and giving according to your means into the common pot for the common good. We actually managed that really easily. And I think if we gave that same leadership, talking the reality, the honesty about migration and talking about the benefits of migration, I think you could change the culture and the environment and the perceptions in our community. We could build more schools and more homes, so there isn't this feeling of having to compete always for too limited resources. And we could do some good old-fashioned community development work to ensure that communities in transition, like Barking and Dagenham, can cope with that transition as it is. And the very final thing is, if we were only just honest in politics, we might then start to rebuild some trust in politics itself. Thank you very much indeed.